Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 705, and today is November 5th, 2024, and that is Election Day here in America. And if you want to share, today's show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. I repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee is where you can find the video version of the show. Make sure you subscribe if you're listening to, watching anywhere like that. And if you're watching on YouTube, definitely hit that notification bell or they will not let you know when new episodes come out. The show is up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, follow me on Twitter at Kyle Anzalone _ where I'm sure I will be posting some tweets tonight throughout the election on things that I think are interesting and significant. All right, everyone, let's get into the show today. And before we get into a little bit of analysis on the election, I did want to start off with this story because I think it's the most important thing I have to talk about today. This one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. soldier injured earlier this year on Gaza pier dies. So a U.S. Army soldier who was injured earlier this year while working on a U.S. constructed temporary pier off Gaza has died due to his wounds, CNN reported on Monday. So Sergeant Davon Stanley, who was 23 years old, was one of 3 U.S. soldiers injured while working on the pier in May. At the time, the Pentagon said 2 suffered very minor injuries, while the other was hurt severely enough to be evacuated for medical care. The Pentagon insisted the injuries were non-combat related, but didn't share any details about the incident. It's unclear what kind of injuries Stanley suffered, but he was medically retired from the Army since he could no longer perform his job. The U.S. Army told CNN that Stanley died on October 31st. The spokesman explained Stanley was injured while supporting the mission that delivered humanitarian aid into Gaza in May of 2024 and receiving treatment in long-term medical care center. The Gaza pier failed to bring any relief to the Palestinians and only operated for about 20 days. It was repeatedly knocked out by weather since it was unable to handle the conditions that are routine to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea where the pier was located. When President Biden ordered the construction of the pier during his State of the Union address in March, aid groups dismissed it as a public relations stunt since it would have been far more efficient to have aid trucks go through land crossings. But Biden refused to pressure Israel to allow more aid into the Strip by ways where it would have actually resulted in the aid getting to the Palestinian people. So according to a report from USAID, that's the U.S. Agency for International Development, Inspector General, Biden ordered the construction of the pier despite warnings from USAID that it would undermine efforts to pressure Israel to allow more aid into Gaza via land crossing. The report also said that the Pentagon was aware that operating the pier in the Eastern Mediterranean would be difficult since sea conditions were heavier than the pier would be able to handle. The pier cost U.S. taxpayers $230 million. At one point, it was torn apart by waves and had to be repaired. And of course, the even worse cost is the life of Sergeant Stanley here. So I want to point out that he died for a failed PR stunt. And, his death isn't even maybe the worst part of this whole story because we now know that at least 60,000 Palestinians, that's from American doctors who served in Gaza, that 60,000 Palestinians have starved to death. So, taking this failed pier attempt rather than pressuring Israel to allow more aid trucks to cross into Gaza by land certainly contributed to the death of some number of Palestinians. But, this really needs to be emphasized and discussed here that the U.S. built this extremely crappy pier out in the middle of the Eastern. When this was done and we saw the pictures, people couldn't believe how crappy that this thing looked. And so it's really no surprise to me. I don't know what happened to this guy, but it did seem that this pier and the causeway that attached to the shore were in rough seas they were fairly narrow, and there weren't guardrails on the side or anything to keep trucks or potentially a soldier from falling off. And so as soon as I saw the pictures, I was concerned that somebody could easily fall off the side of this thing. And then in rough seas at all, people are going to get washed up into the pier and get beat against, the steel of the pier and things like that. It's really easy to see how a casualty could occur when you look at this thing. And so that the Biden administration decided to put American troops' lives in danger, all for a PR stunt when the pressure was building to get more aid to the Palestinians, to put together this pier rather than just have trucks cross the land border crossings that already existed into Gaza, costing the American taxpayer $230 million, American credibility across the world. We looked like a giant joke because of this, and worse, a giant joke that is pulling a joke in front of the world, and easily dismissed joke in front of the world, all to defend Israel's genocide, is also a huge blow to our credibility and reputation on the global stage. And so this is really disgusting, and the fact that this soldier has now died just makes it all that much worse. I don't think there's going to be a lot of discussion about this in the U.S. I think too much attention is going to be paid to the election in the coming days. But for the Biden administration, and that includes Kamala Harris, who have presented themselves as, we're for keeping American troops safe and out of danger, this is just another example of how they've absolutely failed on it because of their subservience to Israel. All right, I don't want to do a ton of election analysis on the show. I know we're here to talk about foreign policy mainly, and so I don't think there's any reason to spend a whole show talking about, because I think most of what contributes to the election is domestic politics. Part of the reason that I've been fairly convinced that Trump was going to win the election was in, I want to say March, I read a report from Bloomberg that the cost to start home ownership, to buy a home, if you're getting a new mortgage and things like that, the average monthly cost was 4 times higher under the Biden administration than the Trump administration. And, kind of growing up in the 90s, one of my first memories and one of the first things that people explained to me about politics is the Bill Clinton quote, "It's the economy, stupid," where he's explaining why people support him, and it's for economic reasons. And so I think the fact that the economy is so much worse under Biden than Trump is likely what's going to drive the vote towards Trump. That does change a little bit with Harris because she's not the sitting president. At the same time, nobody really sees Biden as the commander-in-chief of America. And so, and since they're of the same party and she is in the White House, she does take a lot of responsibility for what Biden has done. I think rightly so. Now, a couple places where I do see an exception of where people may vote on foreign policy is, after the Obama administration, I do think Americans were really worried, in particular communities, the communities where young soldiers come from, about starting major wars in the Middle East and maybe in Europe under Hillary Clinton. I do think that is part of what drove the vote against her. In this particular election, I think if there's going to be foreign policy that weighs in on the vote, it's going to be with the Arab or Muslim American community, and essentially them turning against the Democrats over the war in Gaza / Israel's other actions in the Middle East. And so there's this report from Middle East Eye that I thought was pretty interesting. Grassroots Muslim American organizers say Kamala has lost the Muslim vote. So Middle East Eye reports, with just days remaining before the U.S. presidential election, the emissions by several grassroots Muslim American organizers and private WhatsApp oops corroborate reports that not only is Donald Trump gaining momentum again among sections of the Muslim and Arab American community, but that many have already decided to vote third party to hold the Democrats accountable for the U.S.-sponsored Israeli war on Ukraine. One organizer said, "Unfortunately, polls are not looking good, and reality on the ground is different. We will keep trying and advocating, but unfortunately, the campaign has not done enough to earn the votes of Muslims, progressives, Pakistanis, and Gen Zs. Their unconditional support for Israel will cost them this election. I hope and pray I am wrong, but the writing is on the wall, and the electoral map is looking very bleak." Another said, "I was speaking on our phone-based success, and my good friend came out to me as a Trump supporter despite his being a longtime Democrat. He said his views recently changed in favor of a stricter approach, especially on topics like abortion and foreign policy, but mainly he thinks Trump's will be better in terms of stopping the genocide." And I thought that that was interesting, because in the past couple of days there have been some efforts by the Trump camp to at least offer a light at the end of the tunnel on the war in Gaza. And there's some ways that you could read Trump's statements, and Trump intentionally talks in this way, right? Where you could kind of either take what he says and be outraged by it, you could take it as a joke, you could take it literally, you could take it more figuratively. And so there's so many ways to interpret Trump the way he talks. And so he said things like, I want to see the situation in Gaza ended, or I want to see the Israelis wrap it up or finish the job, which certainly could be very disturbing if he means, Netanyahu, go ahead and kill them all, right? Like that's almost worse than what Biden has done. At the same time, if he means, like, I'm honestly sick of seeing these pictures and it's going to bother me, and he would have given Netanyahu, say, a 3-month time limit that he would have felt firm to after October 7th, and the killing would have been done in January or February of 2024, then rather it dragging out over this past year, then you could kind of read what Trump says as, oh, maybe he would actually be better than Biden on this issue. I'm not trying to sell people one way or another. I'm just saying that this is what Trump offers in the way that he speaks and approaches politics. And I think in kind of the way that politics has evolved and has become so not only social media driven, but in these short little clips and quotes and quips and things like that really drive people to vote one way or another and makes them decide who they're going to vote for president. There is a way to read some of the Trump statements and Trump team statements as being better on the issue. And look, Tulsi Gabbard and Vivek are not necessarily anti-war figures. They are pro-Israel. However, they are people who sometimes say, this war doesn't seem like a great idea. And look, when Trump is embracing people like that, and Kamala Harris is embracing Liz Cheney, who, still supports everything her father did during the Iraq War and during the Bush administration, the torture program, the war in Afghanistan, and all the other horrors that were unleashed upon the Muslim world, well, that's also got to be a pretty, just stark comparison between the two. And then the last thing I will say is J.D. Vance said in the past week that America and Israeli interests don't always align, and the U.S. didn't want a war with Iran, which doesn't necessarily say anything about stopping the genocide in Gaza, but at the same time, even somebody within the administration saying that the positions of the two don't align is fairly interesting. Okay, so the article also says the administrators of the group, that includes the leaders of the Muslims for Harris Twitter account and the Muslim Women for Harris Instagram account, instruct organizers to talking points such as Harris as vice president has no decision-making power to change in policy in Gaza currently. The blame for the current U.S. position must lie mainly with Biden and not with Harris, which I think probably sounds like an unimpressive argument. I think it has a couple of problems. One, Harris needs to be running on what she did in the Biden White House, or else she really doesn't have a legacy or record to run on. So she needs to take credit for what's happened during the Biden administration. Just, at times she wants to like downplay the credit she's taking for certain policies. And so I think that is an issue here. And that's just on the political, like, I think that's going to be kind of the issue for the voter is, okay, so if she's not responsible for anything that Biden did, what is she actually running on? Because she's not somebody who articulates a lot of policy. And the second thing is even if she did just sit quietly in the corner over the past year while Biden organized the policy and she just read the press releases that were put in front of her, again, that doesn't bode particularly well for her being a leader of anything, or wanting her to be president. But additionally, it's just extremely weak. And so the other thing that they're saying is that Harris hosted the first ever Eid al-Adha celebration at her residence, underscoring her respect for Muslim communities. She also met with Muslim leaders in Michigan and Muslim organizers during her campaign, which Donald Trump has done too. And so I don't see how any of that is going to sway any voters. No major predictions on the election or other analysis that I wanted to get into today. I just, again, my thinking is that Trump is going to prevail, but once we know, we could start really talking about the cabinet, and that's the most important thing, right? Especially with these two, Trump and Harris. I think who they surround themselves with is going to be particularly massive, and in some respects, you could find some hopes in the people that Trump has seemed to put around him. Elon Musk has talked about bringing Ron Paul in at least as some kind of advisor. Gabbard and Vivek and JD Vance are at least against the war in Ukraine to some extent. Trump has voiced some opposition against it. But at the same time, personnel is policy. And Trump has also talked about bringing Mike Pompeo into his next administration, which throws out any kind of he would be better on foreign policy. All right, next up here, Dem Sign Letter demanding answers from Biden on expanding U.S. role in Israel's war. I wrote this one for the Institute on November 4th. A group of progressive Democratic members of Congress are demanding answers from the Biden White House about America's role in the Middle East as Israel wages war in Gaza, invades Lebanon, and attacks Iran. So the letter that was signed by Reps Tlaib, Bush, Omar, Lee, and Carson and was sent to Joe Biden last week said, in light of recent regional escalations, including exchanges and hostilities between Israel and Iran and the Israeli government's ground invasions of Lebanon and Gaza, we are deeply concerned about the increasing role and environment of the U.S. armed forces in expanding wars across the Middle East. The letter argues that the Constitution and War Powers Act give control over going to war to Congress, not the president, and Biden has exceeded his war powers. The representatives point to U.S. military aid, diplomat support, and threats to attack Iran to highlight U.S. involvement in Israel's many ongoing conflicts. The letter reads, this current involvement and any additional involvement or deployment of the armed forces in the Israeli government's expanding regional war fall under the definition of hostilities in the War Powers Resolution and are not a response to an imminent or actual attack against the United States. As such, these actions are unauthorized and subject to Congress's authorities pursuant to the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution. The letter also adds a series of questions about the extent of the American military involvement in the Middle East and under what authorities the Biden administration is using to give it the ability to support Israel's wars. Since October 7th, 2023, the White House has flooded Israel with over $22 billion in military support, including arms transfers, waging wars against the Houthis in Yemen, and ramping up the U.S. military presence in the Middle East as a threat to Iran. All right, next up here, Israeli forces killed 33 more Palestinians in Gaza over the past 24 hours. So, Gaza's health ministry said Monday that Israeli forces killed 33 Palestinians and wounded 156 others in the previous 24-hour period. The health ministry also reported the Israeli shelling of the Kamal Adwan hospital in northern Gaza, which has come under repeated attacks, and said there are many injuries. So the ministry wrote on Telegram, the occupation forces continue to bomb and destroy the hospital, affecting all the hospital facilities. There are many injuries among the medical staff and patients. It seems that the decision has been made to execute all the staff who refuse to evacuate the hospital. The hospital's director, Hassam Abu Saif, has said the situation is catastrophic and he hadn't received any notice before the attacks began. He said, according to Al Jazeera, several of our staff have been injured and we are unable to leave the hospital. We do not understand the purpose behind this bombing that has targeted the hospital. Due to the repeated attacks on the hospital, it has not been able to treat patients. An Al Jazeera reporter said northern Gaza has been left without a properly functioning healthcare facility. He said the entire northern part of the strip is left without any proper healthcare facility. The whole healthcare system is gone, is completely collapsing. The Israeli military launched a new assault and imposed a full siege on northern Gaza at the beginning of October as a part of the ethnic cleansing campaign known as the General's Plan. In that time, Israeli forces killed over 18,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza's media office. Medics told Reuters that at least 7 people were killed by an Israeli attack on 2 houses in northern Gaza on Monday. At least 5 other Palestinians were killed by other Israeli strikes in southern and central Gaza. Gaza's health ministry said the latest violence brought the death toll since October 2023 to 43,374 and the number of wounded to 102,261. And of course, those numbers are an undercount. They just count the bodies that are being received and the patients, injured people that show up at the hospitals. All right, and even more dangerous than the actual bombing campaign in Gaza is likely going to be the starvation, the lack of water, the lack of medical aid allowed into Gaza, and this is about to intensify extremely. So Israel informs UN of its plan to end relationship with Palestinian Relief Agency. Israel formally notified the United Nations on Monday of its decision to end its relationship with the UN Palestinian Relief Agency UNRWA, which millions of Palestinians rely on to survive. Israel said it was ending a 1967 agreement that regulated its relations with UNRWA. The move came a week after the Israeli Knesset passed legislation to ban UNRWA activities inside Israel and effectively ended its operations in the West Bank and Gaza as well. The legislation, which is set to fully take effect within 90 days of the bill being passed, prohibits contact between UNRWA and Israeli authorities, making UNRWA aid deliveries into Gaza impossible. The U.S. warned Israel against implementing the legislation, acknowledging it would mean cutting off food supplies to starving women and children, but that hasn't stopped Israel from moving ahead with the plan. UNRWA is responsible for the most significant humanitarian relief operations in Gaza, and the Israeli legislation does not include a plan to replace the agency's efforts. The UN's World Food Program said Monday that it was not in a position to replace UNRWA, pointing to its services, including the administration of emergency shelters, schools, and health centers. Israel has waged war on UNRWA over the past year, killing over 200 of its staff members in Gaza. Israel has claimed a significant number of UNRWA staff members are members of Hamas, but has offered no evidence to support these allegations, which have been strongly rejected by the UN aid agency and an independent inquiry that was conducted by the UN. The Israeli Knesset passed bills to ban UNRWA as the number of aid deliveries into Gaza was at the lowest point over the past year. In early October, Israel imposed a starvation campaign over northern Gaza as a part of efforts to carry out an ethnic cleansing plan known as the General's Plan. And, well, the White House is laughing about this. State Department spokesperson laughs about starvation. This is my Libertarian Institute daily debrief for November 4th. You can sign up for this at the Libertarian Institute on the homepage. I write a little, basically short opinion story, and then I post some of the top news and other stories from the Institute podcast that you should listen to from the past day. So I write, the daily face placed in front of cameras and reporters to justify the ongoing U.S. support for Israel as it conducts a genocide in Gaza is State Department spokesman Matthew Miller. For over a year, Miller has frequently justified Tel Aviv's many war crimes in Gaza with a smile on his face. Miller, who is also known as Smirkula, took his sadistic love for killing Muslims in the Middle East to a new level on Monday when he told a joke about Israel starving Palestinians to death. In an exchange with AP reporter Matt Lee, in the exchange, AP reporter Matt Lee presses Miller on whether Israel is living up to the White House's demands to allow 350 aid trucks into Gaza each day. The question presented a problem because the answer is Israel has tightened its siege on the Strip, with October seeing the fewest aid trucks crossing into Gaza. However, Miller never says anything critical of Israel, so he told a joke. Lee asked Miller if Israel is failing, to which the spokesperson said, "It's not the end of the semester." Then Miller began to cackle. Lee called out Miller for laughing, but Miller never really apologized onto it. He just moved on to the next PR talking point. The reports from northern Gaza over this past month are horrific. Hospitals and shelters bombed and burned, children killed by snipers, and a complete lack of food, water, and other aid entering the region, and Miller laughs. The American healthcare workers who have provided care in Gaza say that at least 60,000 have already starved to death. As Miller laughs, that number increases. And so this is just so disgusting and not surprising too. That's the other part that really bothers you, is that for anybody who's watched Matt Miller every day just with this big grin on his face, get upset with reporters who are rightly bringing up Israeli war crimes to him and saying, well, we can't do anything about it. Israel's doing it. What do you want from me? And, this kind of deflection over and over again has just been disgusting. One of the things that you could imagine playing out over the next 6 months in the U.S., and I think this is maybe the best situation that we could hope for, is that Trump wins the election. And then this time, rather than getting upset about a potential Muslim ban, that if the Trump administration continues this policy, that the liberals get upset in the way they should get upset when you have a spokesman that's laughing and joking about starving tens of thousands of people to death. I mean, this is just beyond conscionable, and yet nobody even cares. And so without, during the Trump administration, you have this like daily outrage, the daily 2 minutes of hate against Donald Trump. Well, if that happens to coalesce around the Palestinian issue, then maybe it could, move the political margins on in a little bit. Unfortunately, I think if Kamala gets elected, nothing's going to change. It's just going to be the same thing where they continue to commit these war crimes and nobody cares because, the Republicans are on the outside and they're going to be more concerned about domestic issues and not the Palestinians. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp. Iran says it won't be deterred by a U.S. bomber deployment to the Middle East. So on Monday, the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman said the U.S. B-52 deployment to the Middle East wouldn't deter Iran, as Iranian officials are vowing there will be a response to Israel's October 26th attack on Iranian territory. The U.S. heavy bombers arrived in the region on Saturday as a part of a deployment meant as a threat to Iran. The Pentagon said the bombers and other U.S. military assets were being sent to the region to defend Israel. When asked about the deployment, The foreign minister said, "We always believe that the presence of America in the region is a destabilizing presence, and that will not deter Iran's resolve to defend itself." According to media reports, Iran is planning a major attack on Israel that may be launched from Iraqi territory. Publicly, Iranian officials are saying that a response is inevitable, and the foreign minister said it will be definitive and decisive. The Iranian president suggested on Sunday that Iran could soften its attack on Israel if a ceasefire is reached in Gaza and Lebanon. But there's no sign of that happening, and I'm kind of surprised that Iran is saying this because after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas political leader in Tehran at the end of July, Iran was apparently planning a response on Israel and held back because the Americans said, we're negotiating a peace deal over here. And, if you carry out this attack, it's going to get in the way. So just hold on. We're working on something. We're going to de-escalate. And I think the Iranians were willing to do that because really what they want to see is de-escalation in the region. However, Israel wasn't negotiating in good faith, and that became fairly obvious and was even reported in Israeli media that Netanyahu was sabotaging the negotiations between Israel and Hamas for a prisoner exchange and an end to fighting, which will kind of unwind all the conflict in the region. And so I'm not sure why Iran is kind of conditioning on it. Maybe it's just a talking point they would like to say afterwards. Well, we offered them if they engaged in serious ceasefire negotiations, we'll hold off, but they won't do it. So back to today's article here. On top of the U.S. bombers being sent to the Middle East, the Pentagon and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin also ordered the deployment of additional U.S. Navy destroyers, a fighter squadron, and tanker aircraft. The U.S. also deployed a THAAD missile defense system and about 100 troops to Israel. If Iran decides to launch a major attack on Israel, it could also target U.S. assets, since the U.S. is vowing to defend Israel, and some of those assets are already in Israel. All right. So, two more stories left today. This one, Israeli attacks on Lebanon have killed over 3,000 since October of 2023. Again, Dave DeCamp, Lebanon's health ministry said Monday that the total number of people killed by Israeli attacks on Lebanon since October 2023 has now crossed 3,000. The death toll is more than twice the number of killed in Israel's last major conflict in the country, the 2006 Lebanon War, which lasted just over a month. The majority of the 3,000 dead have been killed since September 23rd, the day Israel dramatically increased its air campaign in Lebanon, which was followed by a ground invasion of the south in October. The breakdown of casualties is unclear, but many civilians have been killed as Israel has been leveling residential buildings across Gaza. The Israeli campaign has displaced about 1.2 million people, and many Lebanese who followed Israeli evacuation orders were bombed anyways. According to the office of Prime Minister Netanyahu, 72 people have been killed in Israel by Hezbollah attacks, including 30 soldiers over the past year, and 60,000 have been displaced. At least 35 Israeli soldiers have been killed in South Lebanon since the invasion was launched last month. Lebanon's health ministry said Sunday that Israeli airstrikes killed at least 16 people and wounded 90, bringing the death toll to 3,002 and the number of injured to 13,492. All right. So now this one from Jason Ditz from yesterday at antiwar.com. Israel imposes evacuation orders in much of East Lebanon, but many attacks outside of those zones. So last week, Israel imposed massive evacuation orders, including a lot of heavily populated parts of eastern Lebanon, including an evacuation of the entire ancient city of Baalbek. People started fleeing within hours. The missiles started hitting the city and surrounding areas. But where do the people go? With airstrikes having damaged border crossings into Syria, most people are having to go to town and villages outside of the evacuation zones. But are they any safer there? Not so far, as a recent incident in Israeli airstrikes into eastern Lebanon, more hitting areas outside of those evacuation zones. On Friday, 14 airstrikes were reported in eastern Lebanon, and 10 of them were fully outside of the designated zones. That's a big problem because, again, the zones included a lot of the most densely populated areas. The small towns and villages that people are fleeing to have enough problems trying to absorb all these people without also coming under attack themselves. This isn't just an issue in eastern Lebanon. Yesterday, Israel carried out an attack in the country's southwest on a town that wasn't on the evacuation zone, and it's the third time the town has been hit. Inside and outside of the evacuation zones, the attacks seem to be killing more civilians than combatants, and there is growing international criticism of Israel's air war in eastern Lebanon too. Despite Israeli emphasizing that they are targeting Hezbollah strongholds, the casualties are heavy civilians, including a number of children. Reports from Baalbek suggest about a third of the city's 100,000 people have stayed behind, most because they had nowhere to go. Since the areas outside the city don't seem safer, those broad evacuation orders may be viewed more skeptically in the future. So, again, just another thing that if any other country in the world was doing, the U.S., maybe not any other country, if the U.S. was doing it, it would be an issue. If the U.K., say, was doing it, it probably wouldn't be an issue. But for the most part, ordering an evacuation order over a fourth of a country and then bombing outside of those zones anyways would be unconscionable and would be denounced by Washington. But Israel is allowed to do it. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Hope you all have a good election day. I don't expect too much chaos or anything like that. And I'll be back with the show for y'all tomorrow. Hopefully, we will know who the president-elect is, and we can start talking about potential cabinet